Hey everyone, welcome to Read and Recap. Today we will be summarizing Volume 2 of Pride and Prejudice, the novel by Jane Austen. This would be a 3-volume series with each volume summarized in one video. If you haven't watched Volume 1, you can check it out from the links in the description. Volume 2 primarily covers chapters 24 through 42. This section of the novel builds on the evolving relationships between Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy, the consequences of Mr. Collins's marriage proposal, and the complex social interactions among the characters. So grab a seat, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and let's dive right in.
Overview of Volume 2. At the end of Volume 1, Mr. Collins has just proposed to Elizabeth Bennet, and she rejects him, much to her mother's dismay. Soon after, Mr. Collins proposes to Elizabeth's best friend, Charlotte Lucas, who accepts. Elizabeth is bewildered by Charlotte's decision but is forced to come to terms with it. Meanwhile, Elizabeth continues to reflect on her growing dislike of Mr. Darcy, who is often in her thoughts, even though they appear to have no future together. Volume 2 focuses on the developments in the romantic entanglements of Elizabeth, Mr. Darcy, and other major characters such as Jane Bennet, Mr. Bingley, and Mr. Wickham. It delves deeper into the theme of first impressions and misunderstandings, especially between Elizabeth and Darcy. Detailed chapter summaries. Chapter 24. In this chapter, Jane Bennet is heartbroken as Mr. Bingley seems to be drifting away from her. His sisters continue to discourage any contact with the Bennets, and Jane receives a letter from Caroline Bingley stating that Mr. Bingley is unlikely to return to Netherfield anytime soon. This deeply saddens Jane, but she tries to remain composed. Elizabeth grows increasingly angry at the Bingley sisters and Darcy, whom she blames for separating Jane and Bingley. Chapter 25. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, Elizabeth's aunt and uncle, arrive to visit the Bennets. Mrs. Gardiner notices Jane's unhappiness and invites her to stay with them in London, hoping that a change of scenery might lift her spirits. The Gardiners are sensible, kind, and respected by the Bennet family. Mrs. Gardiner also takes an interest in Elizabeth's attraction to Mr. Wickham, warning her that his financial situation might not make him a suitable match. Elizabeth acknowledges this but remains captivated by Wickham's charm. Chapter 26. Jane leaves for London to stay with the Gardiners, and Elizabeth continues to interact with Mr. Wickham. However, she soon learns that Wickham is no longer pursuing her and has turned his attentions to a wealthy young woman named Miss King, who has recently inherited a large fortune. Elizabeth is disappointed but not heartbroken, as she realizes Wickham's interest was never very deep. Mrs. Gardiner writes to Elizabeth, informing her that Jane has not seen Mr. Bingley since arriving in London, further confirming the sisters' efforts to keep the two apart. Chapter 27. Elizabeth decides to visit her friend Charlotte, now Mrs. Collins, at her new home in Hunsford. On her way, she stops in London to spend some time with the Gardiners and Jane. Elizabeth is disheartened to see that Jane's spirits remain low due to Bingley's absence, though Jane tries to appear cheerful. After some time, Elizabeth continues her journey to Hunsford, where she looks forward to observing her friend's new life with Mr. Collins. Chapter 28. Elizabeth arrives at the parsonage in Hunsford and is warmly greeted by Charlotte and Mr. Collins. Though Charlotte seems content with her marriage, Elizabeth remains skeptical about how happy she could be with a man as pompous and ridiculous as Mr. Collins. Elizabeth finds it difficult to hide her disdain for Mr. Collins' obsequiousness, especially when he speaks about his esteemed patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Chapter 29. Lady Catherine de Bourgh, a wealthy noblewoman and Mr. Darcy's aunt, invites Elizabeth, Charlotte, and Mr. Collins to dine at her grand estate, Rosings Park. Lady Catherine is a domineering and arrogant woman, and during the visit, she makes a series of intrusive and condescending remarks about Elizabeth's family and upbringing. Despite this, Elizabeth maintains her composure and refuses to be intimidated. Lady Catherine is impressed by Elizabeth's self-assurance, though she continues to offer unsolicited advice. Chapter 30. Elizabeth spends more time in Hunsford, and the visits to Rosings Park become more frequent. Mr. Collins is eager to please Lady Catherine and takes every opportunity to praise her. Elizabeth, on the other hand, grows increasingly frustrated by Lady Catherine's overbearing personality. During one of these visits, Elizabeth learns that Lady Catherine's daughter, Miss de Bourgh, is expected to marry Mr. Darcy, according to family expectations. Chapter 31. While staying in Hunsford, Elizabeth is surprised to learn that Mr. Darcy will soon arrive at Rosings Park to visit his aunt. When Mr. Darcy and his cousin, Colonel Fitzwilliam, arrive, Elizabeth observes Mr. Darcy's usual cold demeanor, though Colonel Fitzwilliam is charming and friendly. The group often meets at Rosings for dinner, and Elizabeth notices that Mr. Darcy seems to be watching her closely during these gatherings. Chapter 32. In a surprising turn of events, Mr. Darcy visits Elizabeth alone at the parsonage. Their conversation is awkward and stilted, and Elizabeth is perplexed by Darcy's behavior, as he seems to be struggling with his emotions. Darcy's attentions become more frequent, leading Elizabeth to believe that he is developing feelings for her, though she continues to dislike him. Chapter 33. Elizabeth also spends time with Colonel Fitzwilliam, who is sociable and easy to talk to. During one of their conversations, Fitzwilliam unintentionally reveals that Darcy was responsible for separating Mr. Bingley from Jane, believing that Jane was not genuinely in love with Bingley. This revelation shocks and angers Elizabeth, confirming her negative opinion of Darcy. Chapter 34. In a dramatic moment, Darcy unexpectedly arrives at the parsonage and, to Elizabeth's astonishment, confesses his love for her and proposes marriage. However, Darcy's proposal is awkward and condescending, as he emphasizes the inferiority of Elizabeth's family and the social disadvantages of the match. Elizabeth is outraged by his arrogance and accuses him of ruining Jane's happiness by separating her from Bingley. She also confronts him about his treatment of Mr. Wickham, whom Darcy allegedly wronged. Darcy, though shocked by her rejection, listens to her accusations but remains composed. He leaves abruptly after Elizabeth vehemently rejects him. Chapter 35. The following day, Darcy hands Elizabeth a letter explaining his actions. In the letter, he admits to interfering in Jane and Bingley's relationship but insists that he did so because he genuinely believed Jane was not in love with Bingley. Darcy also provides a detailed account of his history with Mr. Wickham, revealing that Wickham had attempted to elope with Darcy's younger sister, Georgiana, to gain access to her fortune. Darcy's letter forces Elizabeth to reconsider her judgments of both Darcy and Wickham. Chapter 36. Elizabeth reflects on Darcy's letter and gradually realizes that she has been wrong in her assumptions. She acknowledges that Darcy's account of Wickham's character is likely true and that she had been too quick to believe Wickham's version of events. Elizabeth feels ashamed of her prejudices and recognizes that she misjudged Darcy based on his aloofness and Wickham's charm. This revelation marks a turning point in Elizabeth's feelings toward Darcy. Chapter 37. After spending a few more days at Hunsford, Elizabeth returns to her family home in Longbourn. Before she leaves, Lady Catherine invites her to Rosings for a final visit, where she offers more unsolicited advice and inquires about Elizabeth's family. Despite Lady Catherine's haughty manner, Elizabeth remains polite but firm, resisting the urge to be submissive like Mr. Collins. Chapter 38. Elizabeth bids farewell to Charlotte and Mr. Collins and returns home to Longbourn. During her journey, she continues to reflect on Darcy's letter and her shifting feelings toward him. Elizabeth is eager to see her family again, though she is apprehensive about how her mother and sisters will react to the news that Mr. Bingley is not returning to Netherfield. She is also concerned about her new understanding of Mr. Darcy and how it complicates her feelings. Chapter 39. When Elizabeth arrives home, she is reunited with her sisters. Lydia and Kitty, in particular, are still obsessed with the officers stationed nearby, and they talk excitedly about a trip to Brighton, where the militia is moving. Elizabeth is worried about Lydia's impulsive nature and her obsession with the officers, particularly because of what she now knows about Wickham's true character. Chapter 40. Elizabeth confides in Jane about Darcy's proposal and the contents of his letter. Jane is shocked but tries to see the good in both Darcy and Wickham. Elizabeth decides not to reveal the full extent of Wickham's actions, including his attempt to elope with Georgiana Darcy, as she does not want to alarm her family. She also advises Jane to try to forget about Mr. Bingley, though Jane still harbors feelings for him. Chapter 41. Lydia receives an invitation from Mrs. Forster, the wife of the colonel of the regiment, to accompany her to Brighton. Elizabeth tries to dissuade her father from letting Lydia go, fearing that her frivolous behavior will lead to trouble. However, Mr. Bennet dismisses Elizabeth's concerns and allows Lydia to go, much to Elizabeth's frustration. Chapter 42. Elizabeth grows increasingly concerned about Lydia's departure to Brighton, as she fears that her sister's reckless behavior will damage the family's reputation. Meanwhile, Elizabeth continues to reflect on her evolving feelings toward Mr. Darcy and the complexities of her emotions. She recognizes that her initial impressions were flawed and begins to see Darcy in a more favorable light, though she is unsure whether she will ever see him again. Conclusion. Volume 2 of Pride and Prejudice marks a significant shift in the plot, especially in Elizabeth's understanding of Mr. Darcy's character. The proposal scene, Darcy's letter, and Elizabeth's reflections on her prejudices form the emotional core of this volume. By the end, Elizabeth is grappling with the complexities of her feelings, while the tension surrounding Lydia's flirtations with the officers foreshadows the dramatic events to come in Volume 3.
Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more awesome content. And to make sure you never miss an upload, tap the notification bell so you're always the first to know when new videos drop. Stay tuned for Volume 3. If you want to listen to Volume 1, you can check out the video right here. You can also find links to purchase the book in audio, PDF, or hard copy from the links in the description. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next one.